Tolkien loved his forests, and Middle-earth has some very famous ones: Fangorn, Mirkwood, and Lothlorien to name a few. These forests, along with many others, are encountered by the characters, have vast histories, and are quite relevant to the story. But there is one forest that is not. It's remote, unimportant, just a name on the map, yet nevertheless it's worth talking about. In this video, we talk about Eryn Vorn, the Black Woods. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, you'll find the forest of Eryn Vorn on a cape in the region of Minhiriath in Eriador, far from pretty much anything important. You could even go as far as saying that it's one of the most isolated places in Middle-earth. The name Eryn Vorn means black or dark woods, which certainly makes it sound ominous. But as far as we're aware, there's nothing particularly evil about this place. My apologies if you expected that to be the case. Instead, the name comes from the fact that the forest is made up of dark pine trees, as explained on Tolkien's annotated map of Middle-earth. At the end of the Third Age, Eryn Vorn is quite small, but this wasn't always the case, because in the First Age, Eryn Vorn was part of a massive network of forests, which existed across much of northwestern Middle-earth. In Eriador, these vast continuous forests covered almost all of the regions of Enadwaith and Minhiriath, the entirety of the coastline, and as far north as where the Old Forest could be found. As Elrond put it at the Council of Elrond, in those days a squirrel could go from tree to tree without touching the ground, from Dunland to the Shire. In the First Age and much of the early Second Age, these forests were home to groups of men, later known as the pre-Numenoreans, who had spread throughout Gondor, Calenhadon, and much of southern Eriador. They were related to the second house of the Edain, the House of Haleth, who did not speak a related language to the House of Beor and the House of Hador. This is important because when the first Numenorean explorers arrived in the 8th century of the Second Age, they did not recognize their kinship to the pre-Numenoreans, unlike with the men of Eriador who dwelt to the north. And because the pre-Numenoreans were primitive by Numenorean standards, building no towns and living as simple hunters and fishers, this led to the Numenoreans believing them to be men of darkness, those who had worshipped Morgoth, and they ended up labeling them as the Gwytherim, the Shadow People. Things only became worse when the Numenoreans started using the woodlands of Enadwaith and Minhiriath to supply the lumber that built their ships. The Gwytherim saw this as the destruction of their homelands, so they became hostile to the Numenorean presence, ambushing them and attacking their outposts. In response, the Numenoreans accelerated their deforestation, built more roads and outposts, and even stopped replanting the woodlands they had destroyed. Over the centuries, the situation became untenable for the Gwytherim, who, although warlike, lived mostly in scattered, decentralized communities, and they largely abandoned their forests. The largest concentration of them ended up in Dunland, at the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and they would become known as the Dunlendings. Another group ended up on the coastline between the rivers Gwathlo and Isen, being later described as a fairly numerous but barbarous fisherfolk. But the third group, comprised of those who lived in Minhiriath, fled in the opposite direction, going north to the wooded cape of Eryn Vorn, which they probably believed to be remote enough to be safe from Numenorean incursions. They dared not go any further north by crossing the river Bearanduin, because beyond the river was elven country and the Gwytherim were afraid of the elves. The decision to remove themselves ended up being wise. During the War of the Elves and Sauron in the late 17th century, most of the remaining forests of southern Eriador were burned. Some of the exiled Gwytherim actually supported Sauron during the war, but we're not sure if the men in Eryn Vorn were among them. Eryn Vorn and the Old Forest were among the few small survivors of the great forests that had covered the region, and it would not be until the late Third Age where some of these forests had recovered. Afterwards, Eriador became subject to Numenorean colonization, but it's unknown how much they interacted with Eryn Vorn and the surviving Gwytherim who lived there. The fact that most of the Dunedain of the later established Arnor lived far inland, and that the port of Londare was abandoned in favour of the river port of Tharbad, suggests that they had little interest in the coasts. Like the Dunlendings in Enadwaith, who became nominal subjects of Gondor, these men might also have been considered nominal subjects of Arnor and later Cardolan, but like the Dunlendings, they may have been totally left alone, considering their grim history with the Numenoreans. Because of this, like the Dunlendings, there's a good chance they may not have spoken Westron, or at least most of them were not proficient in it. The remoteness of Eryn Vorn continued to work in its favour during the Third Age. During the wars against Angmar, Carnevali was devastated, but it's unlikely any of the invaders went as far south as Eryn Vorn. Later, the Great Plague ripped through southern Eriador, and the remaining population of Minhiriath was destroyed. The region was then left almost entirely deserted, with the exception of Eryn Vorn. Like the Dunlendings, the men of Eryn Vorn were isolated and insular enough to be little affected, if at all, and ended up surviving. Not much else is said about them, except that they were still around by the end of the Third Age, existing as a secretive hunter folk that were small in number. The fact that their existence was known about suggests that they did have some interactions with other men, possibly travellers who passed through Minhiriath. We're also told that Bree was the furthest west settlement of men in Middle-earth. This can only be true if someone had been to Eryn Vorn to verify that the men living there did not build anything more than homesteads, certainly nothing substantial enough to deserve being on the map. What we do know is that the men of Eryn Vorn were amongst the few peoples to be entirely unaffected by the War of the Ring. Even their distant kinsmen were not immune. The Dunlendings ended up serving in Saruman's armies, and the men of Bree were forced to fight off an attack by bandits. Perhaps the closest Eryn Vorn came to being affected was when the Nazgul passed through Minhiriath while searching for the One Ring. We're told that the word of them spread, and that lonely men fled away. It's possible that these lonely men originated from Eryn Vorn, or perhaps they were just Dunlendings or other travellers. In the Fourth Age, Eryn Vorn would have once again found itself within the bounds of Arnor, this time as the reunited kingdom. However, it's unlikely the locals would have known anything about this for a while, or even really cared, and given how much empty land there was in Eriador, it probably would have been a long time before any settlers came near Eryn Vorn. There were certainly many other more desirable places that could be settled first. The only way I can see Eryn Vorn being bothered is if there was a huge demand for lumber, but provided no one was building a navy, that shouldn't have become an issue. It's also possible that Aragorn or one of his descendants would have granted the forest some form of autonomy, just as it had been given to the Shire and the Druidan Forest. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Eryn Vorn is one of those places that I always wanted to make a video about, but wasn't sure if there was really enough information about it to be worth it. The name legitimately appears in Tolkien's writings like not even half a dozen times. It literally is just a place on the map. If you want to visit Eryn Vorn, you actually can't. Nope, not even Lotro has made it to Eryn Vorn, and I'm not really sure it ever will. However, the forest does make a few appearances in different tabletop RPGs, which I haven't played and know nothing about really. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Eryn Vorn is definitely not part of any famous Axe World Tour.